Do. So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. This is a weekly forum event that's run every Tuesday, 11 till 12. I am the continual co-host, which is great because I don't have to put the content together. I just get brilliant guest speakers to come on with me every week. But I kind of help facilitate running it and getting people involved. So nice to see so many people, including some new faces and some old ones that I haven't seen for a little while. Lara, I'm looking at you. Good to see you. It's been a while since we've caught up. So my name's Matthew Baird. This whole concept of the Social Housing Roundtable started during the lockdowns when people didn't want to talk about recruitment anymore. They didn't want to talk about hiring. They couldn't keep hold of their own staff. But they did need to come together and still share ideas and best practice. And from there, this idea was kind of born, and in 2022, particularly last year, it really took off. We ran 48 of these last year. They were excellent, so much fun and so much to learn. There are recordings of almost all of them up on YouTube. And they're all funded by my recruitment business. So as I say, I've been in social housing recruitment now for 11 years. I keep getting told off because I don't plug it enough that I do recruitment. But it is just me. I love this sector. I know this sector, and I recruit from top to bottom. So if anyone does need help, that's why these stay free, because of that. But that's the last you're going to hear on the recruitment side from me today, unless it comes up in the general conversation. This week's guest is Claire Fouracre, who joined us, having obviously been with us on one event last year. The recording is available of that. So Claire, I'm going to pass over to you to kind of introduce yourself and where today's topic came about from.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thanks, Matt. And morning, everyone. Thanks for having me, I should say, back again, Matt, and everybody for joining today. So, yeah, I'm Claire Fouracre. I've been involved in the housing sector for over 10 years now, primarily from a housing management background. Started working on the front line as an income officer, moved into management, and I'm currently a non-executive director, so a board member for a provider on the Wirral. I'm really passionate about the sector, a bit like Matt, really, I guess, and what we deliver to tenants in the wider community. And the issue around damp and mould, it's something I've seen throughout my career, and I feel that in my current position on a board, you know, it's something that I've got a real responsibility towards, and you know, that recognising the importance of it, I guess, and wanted to bring that topic to the round table for that reason, really.
Absolutely brilliant. I know we've talked about it before, and I think the big conversation point this year, I think throughout housing, you can have one side which is that recruitment retention piece, and the other side is going to be about accountability. And I think there's a lot of ideas and thoughts on what today will bring. A little bit of housekeeping just before we start your short presentation, and then it will open up into a general discussion. So if anyone has any questions or anything like that at any point, please feel free to use the chat function. I'll be keeping an eye on that throughout. Alternatively, if you're happy to do so, which would be amazing if you do, please use the raise hand function, and I will bring you into the conversation at any point. I will be trying to make sure that we prioritise those who've not spoken before and those kind of things. Feel free to do introductions in the chat as well if you wish to. Basically, be courteous, be kind, you know, but also don't be afraid to ask the difficult questions. That's the whole point in these roundtables, is actually try to inspire change. So on that, I'll pass over to you to start your short presentation on, I guess, the different discussion points of what we're going to look at today.
Yes, that's fine. Thanks, Matt. If everyone just bears with me now, sorry, because I was saying to Matt earlier, Zoom is not my sort of, I'm a Teams person usually, so hopefully this share will go okay, is what I'm saying here.
That's working for me. Yeah, we're up and running. Brilliant. Oh, but you've somehow muted yourself again. I don't know how you managed this one last time as well. You started the thing and somehow muted at the same time. It was quite the talent. We can just get you unmuted.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll get you back.
All right. Yep. Apologies, everybody. You did your hits on that part. Thanks, Matt. Right. Okay. So I've introduced myself earlier.
Although your sound has gone very off.
Is that okay? There was a
That's
bit of
better, much
interference
better.
I could hear. Is that okay now?
Yeah, got it now, all sorted.
Perfect. Okay, we couldn't be nervous enough doing it on Zoom and everything else, eh? Right. So yeah, opening slide really just to sort of set the scene, and I guess from my point of view, reflecting as well on who has taken responsibility, who took responsibility. The image is of our Baishak, who tragically passed away on the 21st of December 2020, having just turned 2 years old. Now, the coroner did a full report on the case, which started on 27th of December, not long after he'd passed away. That was released on the 16th of November last year. That report concluded, to quote from it there, "Our died as a result of a severe respiratory condition due to prolonged exposure to mould in his home environment. Action to treat and prevent the mould was not taken." So I think in terms of who took responsibility here and who has previously, it's fair to say that historically blame has too often been shifted onto tenants. I think that's sort of alluded to in the Ombudsman Spotlight report quite heavily really, and really, if we're all honest as individuals within the sector, I think we will have witnessed this type of approach over the years, looking at tenants' lifestyle, not really getting to the issue of the problems and really being reactive, and that blame culture that's described throughout the report, I think it's certainly fair to say that that's been in existence. The coroner's report did point to wider issues, which I'll sort of go on to explore briefly before we open up conversation, but around lack of legislation and advice, and challenges that the sector is facing, largely resulting from government policy amongst other things. Now, in the case of Rochdale Borough-wide Housing, the chief executive was sacked. For me, I think there's huge responsibility on the part of the board alongside the executive. But has this issue been high enough on agendas historically is a question I would be asking, and why has it taken a tragedy like this for us to be examining accountability and responsibility? There's certainly been warning signs there. I think we've all, again, over the years, seen media coverage, things like Panorama. The images on the slide there of damp and mould, they're not things we're unfamiliar with. And the sector really has been reactive and almost sort of not, well, far from proactive enough. So I suppose moving forward and thinking about responsibility and accountability, this slide here gives some of the key narratives from the Ombudsman Spotlight report. And for me, I think the key responsibility lies with leadership, both executive and non-executive, to ensure that this culture is set throughout organisations in future. A strategic approach will be needed to ensure this zero tolerance approach to damp and mould is set out, robust frameworks and policies being put in place. But also alongside that, it's imperative that the culture and language is right. And that again starts with senior leadership to set that in the tone of all communications around this subject. Of course, then there's the further to support to the wider teams to embed this, so training, learning, ensuring the right expertise throughout the organisation. Quite importantly, working with tenants on it as well. Those policies, processes, procedures, and making sure that officers have got the right tools. So that, there's a lot around data to be proactive, but making sure the right tools are there to allow and facilitate the data capture, and that proactive record keeping as well to kind of back up the approach, and also having the right complaints processes. And there's a huge part in the report around finding the silence. So who's not able to come forward and make the complaints, or what are those gaps? But as I've said, for me, I think boards have a massive responsibility. It's something I take really seriously in my role, and I think we've absolutely got to get a grip of the issue, and have a real and honest understanding of where our organisations are at. I think that's key, and we have to be accountable for that in the position. I think recognising the impact that this issue has on tenants is really important, and not having that disconnect between boards and tenants. So it's described in the report as a real and profound experience. And I think boards need to really recognise that and have a clear understanding of that. You know, the distress, the disruption that the issue causes, the impact on mental health, and ultimately the very real impact on health, safety and well-being. But have to hold the exec to account on this and challenge. Also support, which comes through when an organisation is a learning organisation, which there's a huge push on in the report itself. I think it's key to recognise that it's stated that there needs to be a complaints lead on governing bodies, and boards need to be active in assessing procedures. So those deeper dives that have to be taking place, boards have to have that responsibility. It can't continue to accept this kind of situation of us being told it's a one-off incident or there's a historic issue there at that property. That absolutely has to be challenged, and that there has to be accountability where those kind of things are going on. And the board role modelling really through that to sort of say, well, this has to be taken seriously. We've got to have this zero tolerance approach and be proactive about this issue. So the next slide is a bit of a catch-all in terms of responsibility, and I guess it's me kind of saying, we've examined the senior leadership, the exec, the non-exec, the sort of the governance role here, but ultimately, I would say that there's universal responsibility across organisations. Whatever role anyone is playing in a housing organisation, be that within customer service, housing management, handling complaints, engaging with tenants, repairs, assets, development, and contractors themselves. While culture is set by leadership and boards govern, it's important that everybody within an organisation recognises that they've got a responsibility and the matter needs to be taken seriously, that tenants are heard when incidents are being reported, and we're not sort of lacking in empathy and understanding of what the issue is and how serious it can be. I think where things are not working, it's important.
And Tony, you can join us soon. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
That's right. That was a
there. All right.
Muted. I'm keeping on top of it.
But I think it also, sorry, I was going to go on to say is the importance of challenge as well, where things are not working, that there is that challenge as part of that learning culture that's identified in the report. So there's that accountability as well, to sort of for leadership to be receptive when processes are not working on the ground and we're perhaps not getting the outcomes we should be, that there is that openness for challenge, so that there is that continuous learning and improvement, which is quite clear, as a priority in the report. I think just going back to Awab's case, his family had reported damp in 2017, which was just before he was born. They were told to paint over it, but they weren't told they would need special paint. So obviously there was frontline lack of understanding there about perhaps that what the family would understand by that advice, and what support might be needed and what would be an adequate response to that. And I think that's, it's important for frontline officers to recognise that they do have responsibility there as well as leadership and boards. Just to sort of examine in full, really, I thought it was important to also have a look at tenants' responsibility. So while it's absolutely clear that we need to move away from the blame culture, and sort of putting things, it's not a lifestyle issue anymore, that's not acceptable. Routine sort of normal things that people do, like bathing, cooking, washing, drying clothes, we as causal factors can't just be blamed any longer. That cannot continue to be the case. As organisations, we have to be proactive and go beyond that and look for root causes in terms of giving advice and sorting things out as well, where there is root cause beyond that. And we have to be clear on that as a sector. But what responsibility do tenants have? So I noted within the Spotlight report that there is a reference to co-producing communications and advice that shares responsibility. So what is that shared responsibility? I guess reporting issues would be part of that, although not to be relied upon. Again, reminding that we are to have a proactive approach, but there is that responsibility for tenants to take on the advice that is shared, and to report issues. And there's a question here in terms of access. If we're taking a proactive approach as organisations, what happens when we can't gain access to properties, maybe to get things sorted? And I'm not sure. I don't have all the answers. It's a question, I guess, that once we open up discussion, it'd be interesting to hear people's views on how that may be tackled going forward. And then, as alluded to at the beginning, really the wider responsibility. So I've talked about ourselves as organisations, leaders, boards, officers and tenants, and the responsibility that we all carry and how we can each be accountable. But it's even more universal than that, really. Government policies have arguably contributed to where we find ourselves. As I've put on there some of those key bullet points, we've got stock condition issues. There's been a lack of investment, lack of development, which has left us with a chronic lack, really, of affordable housing. And in some cases, the housing that we have isn't really fit for those normal activities that I outlined earlier. It can't, the ventilation's not adequate, and the properties themselves are no longer. They need significant investment. There's long waiting lists, there's overcrowding. It was notable in the Ombudsman report that a lot of the issues around complaints around damp and mould, and where there'd been issues with how they'd been handled, were in London boroughs or providers with a heavy stock base in London, and where some of these issues are much more acute. So that link there is clear. The cost of living crisis that we find ourselves in puts tenants under pressure, struggling to heat their homes and having other limited choices. And of course, budget pressures faced by providers, as I say, limited stock improvement, new development, and also the pressures of things like carbon neutral as well. And all of that putting the pressure on the budgets to be able to perhaps make the improvements or develop the new stock that we so badly need. The coroner did also highlight lack of legislation and also advice available to the sector. Also noted that within the decent home guidance, there was nothing on damp and mould or ventilation, and there was actually some forms within health and safety rating system that weren't actually reflective of current known risks. So beyond providers, there certainly is other areas of responsibility here and accountability to be picked up. So to summarise, this slide I've kept quite simple, really, but ultimately I think that there's varied levels of responsibility and accountability here, but certainly there's responsibility in all parts, and with that levels of accountability. It's crucial that we do change the culture and get this right. I think for me, my view is that the greater levels of accountability lie with those with the greatest responsibility. As I've said a couple of times here, I think, as leaders, and certainly I've said myself, being a board member, it's something I take very seriously. The impact that, recognising the impact on tenants. And I think we can't lose the disconnect with that itself. I think
on that, there's already been, well, yeah, please do, sorry.
It was just to sort of end really on a question, I guess, is should it have taken the death of a child to recognise this, though, and implement change? And whilst we're also looking at this damp and mould in this way as something that perhaps has been there and we've not acted and not been proactive, maybe not to limit this approach and thinking to damp and mould, but also what's the next thing out, what are we sleepwalking into here that we're perhaps not considering, or we're perhaps sitting back as a sector on. I think that's something else to kind of take away and consider. So I think that's a good point to open up conversation, and
It
hopefully give
certainly
me
is.
some things to think about. So I'll try and stop sharing and rejoin everybody.
That's right. I can. Oh, there we are. Lovely. So there were actually some really interesting
good.
things made in the chat while you were doing those. And as I say, if anybody does want to come in, please raise your hand, because this is going to be, I think, quite an interesting debate. I agree with you that for years, the question mark has always been over the tenant, it's been over the resident, it's been over the person who is living in the property. And as Claire Patterson said there, that as you mentioned, the lifestyle being blamed for damp is people doing normal things, bathing, cooking, drying clothes, and not being able to afford the use of a tumble dryer or heating, which was only going to get worse. And as someone who doesn't have a tumble dryer, I completely agree. There are methods I take in my own home, but it is very easy, particularly in this weather, to try and kind of go, well, what do I sacrifice? And damp and mould continues. And I know at some point probably touch on right to buy, and actually the quality of some of the stock out there, the amount of directors I've been speaking with lately who've gone, we've just started doing some deep dives and we had no idea how bad the problem was, and we just, when it gets bad, we move that tenant somewhere else and we whitewash the walls and we do whatever else, and then we move the next one in until it comes back. And I'm going, how is that policy? But it's because they're going, well, that's the quality of the stock. I was like, then you need to fix your stock. But I appreciate that's just not that easy. Matt Cooney said there, I agree we should not blame, but we should also not underestimate how difficult it is for our people on the front line. Language and tone is very important, and it is very easy for people to say things that can be misinterpreted. We need to train people on changing the dialogue. Is this something you've come across, Claire?
You're all for again. Good luck with the business. I'm glad you're back up on it.
Yep, there we are. Go on, Claire, back to you again. Sorry. Just on that dialogue piece, really, is that something you're noticing in your role in the board? I mean, I've only just started on the board myself, but is that language piece being discussed?
There's certainly been discussion of it, yeah, and I think it is important. And I do, I completely recognise the comment there about the pressures for those on the front line. Absolutely agree. As I said, I've been there myself as an officer on the front line, and I think that's the sort of the question I posed during that about the sort of the access. There is this shared responsibility alluded to in the report, and I'd be interesting if anyone today has any comments around that or any thoughts about because we can be proactive and we can sort of make all the efforts in that sense, but there is this element of what if we can't gain access to a property to deal with some of those sort of root cause issues, or what if the sort of communications break down because of issues? It'd be interesting if there are any comments there, but absolutely recognise the issues there, and that's why I do feel there's a huge responsibility here on leadership to set that tone and deliver that training and get that right throughout the organisation. It is a cultural thing that needs to change.
And that does lay with the board. I completely agree with you, but there's also obviously the question, and I actually brought this up on LinkedIn to anyone following the conversation. Tom Murtha said, well, obviously it lies with the board, and my response was, as long as people are being honest with the board. And he's like, do you think people would lie? And the sarcasm dripping through that was huge. And there is definitely a piece there of that level of accountability. It's sometimes difficult because you're relying on trust from all parties. Judith Radcliffe has put there in the chat, the figure appears to indicate London. But is that just because more responses from there were received? In the pandemic, social housing issues, perhaps causing virus spreading, including overcrowding, also appeared problematic in the West Midlands, for example. I can absolutely tell you, because I sit on the Supported Exempt Accommodation Forum, particularly in supported accommodation in the West Midlands, damp and mould is rife and quality of stock is awful in some places. And so it isn't, but I think London will always have the spotlight shine on it because of it being London, I guess. Iona, with damp, mould and ventilation not being part of the home standard, should a decent home standard be reviewed? I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts on that they'd like to jump in on. I will get people chatting, I promise. We'll dive back to that one, but I don't think it was her at all. I say feel free, if you would like to join in, please use the reactions and raise hand and I'll bring you in on the conversation. I was going to guess the name and I hate guessing names. So.
There you go. Jabeen. It's
Jabeen. Really nice to have you with us, Jabeen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Really, really important conversation that we're having today. I just wanted to jump in on the Decent Home Standard. It is being reviewed as part of the Decent Home Standard review, so that's in progress. I think it's been recognised for a while that damp and mould is an issue, and it's part of the review. So I'm expecting probably this year we'll hear something, the outcome of that.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I think anything on this. I mean, I was just saw in the chat there. There was a point. I think Paula Locke said there. It shouldn't take the loss of a life. That's often the sad outcome, and it's exactly that. Sometimes it takes something this unfortunately ground shattering to create change and have such impact. Sarah Jackson, I'm going to bring you in.
Hi Matt, hi everybody. Sorry I'm a bit late, so I'm a bit late to the conversation, but I was just going to respond really to the sort of discussions around the sort of boards requirement really, because I think we work with a lot of boards, and certainly every board meeting that I've sat in on, observed over the last sort of 3 or 4 months have all had damp and mould high on their agenda. But I think it's not just the reviewing the policy and the approach, it's reviewing decisions around investment. So there are some great examples out there of providers who are putting more money into damp proof courses and recognising the root cause, so they're not just treating the problem, they're going to the root. And it's not easy, is it? Because we know how much damp proof courses cost, and we know how poor some of the stock condition is because it's just so old. But I think it is refreshing, certainly for me, to see that some boards are really starting to review everything, not just, like I said, from the sort of policy and procedure and training, but actually the whole raft, including some of those really important investment choices, which again link to that whole discussion about stock condition and decent home standard.
I completely agree with you both, and it's brilliant that and I shouldn't need to say this, but it's great that I'm speaking with 2 women who are on boards. I think there's a huge issue as well of the diversity of your board and of lived experience. I know, Claire, you've mentioned about being a housing officer and a frontline officer and things like that, and the difference having lived experience on your board brings, because it brings questions that otherwise don't get asked. And when you do these things like talking about damp and mould, I wonder if I don't think we'll ever get there, but if you could have a correlation between the diversity of a board and how well they deal with some of the queries could come up, I think it would be a really interesting partnership. I'm going to bring Claire Patterson in a moment. Lawrence has said in the chat, I agree with Matt Cooney, my teams have worked under huge pressure over this winter period. How they haven't fallen over is beyond me. And I hate guessing names, but I haven't got you to point on that. Tadas, apologies if that's wrong. I recently had a private rent tenant in a brand new studio flat. He's starting to have small damp issues. Speaking with him, it's stated because he can't afford to keep heating up in the flat. What would be the solution in this case? And I think that's something that we're going to be coming up more and more. I'm going to go to Claire Patterson and then back to the chat. So Claire, good to have you with us.
Morning.
Morning.
Please forgive the state of me. I just wanted to pick up, as you won't be surprised, on the point about data-driven. Judith mentioned it as well in the chat. That there is a fear that organisations will see that and go, oh, we need to collect more data. But the tragedy here at Rochdale was that they had the information. They knew about the problem. They knew about there being a young child in the property, but it wasn't joined up. They didn't all know the situation. The information wasn't available. So, like Claire has on her slides as well, that it's about record keeping and good communication. The thing that jumps out at me is in the coroner's report she talked about potential racism and that language barrier. And I do fear that some organisations will go, oh well, we need to collect loads of information about people's ethnicity and their languages they speak and that kind of thing. I was really pleased to see that Rochdale Borough-wide Council Housing, have put in place a video, I think it is, system where people can get translations. They don't have to have on their record anywhere that they need a certain language. That data's not being collected necessarily, but there is a system there. There is a way that people can access translations if they need it, and that's a solution that is not collecting data, but should help that communication and that language barrier. I'm going to stop talking.
Please, I mean, look, I really hope you're feeling better soon, and thank you for the input. It's interesting to hear about processes like that, and I mean, obviously you mentioned there both about the the data side and that, is there institutional racism, is there unconscious bias, and from speaking with a number of directors, heads of service over the last few months, it's clear that there is unfortunately unconscious bias of some communities that we support and work with, and it needs rectifying. I'm going to come back to the point Talis made shortly, because Judith had actually said there, to your point, Claire, I seem to see that one slide said data driven. Is there a danger that figures and statistics will replace real conversations with real people and perhaps make wrongful assumptions made as a direct or indirect result? I know if you were feeling better, you would no doubt categorically agree with this. And I couldn't agree. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you're pointing there. Sometimes we can go, well, this is what the data says. It's like, well, what does the person actually say? A few more points in the chat. If anyone would like to dive in, please, as I say, raise a hand. I'll bring you in. Edward Crouch: managers and boards paid huge attention to CP12 compliance. Why is there not the same rigor and scrutiny on condensation, damp and mould? I think we'll begin to see a massive shift in that. I know certainly from being on a board myself, that is coming up every single conversation now. And unfortunately, it does tie, I think, back into the fact that the tragedy has occurred. But also, I think it's partly that, as I mentioned before, in some large organisations, I'm speaking to those senior managers and directors, and they're only just starting to realise just how bad this problem is. And that could be a cultural thing. It could be teams are inundated and just go, oh, it's damp and mould. I'll give them the same old details. We'll go and wash the walls or whatever. They're never getting to the root cause, and now it's too late. Akash Chopra: are there currently any preventative measures in place in order to identify damp and mould before it becomes an issue? I personally don't know if anyone knows of any. David, yes, please. It's great. And sometimes people use the thing, and sometimes I literally have to keep an eye out. The fact that you've actually physically raised a hand, brilliant.
Yeah, I quite like the idea of physically raising my hand. This is my first time. This is my first time here, and I'm a technology provider and not a housing association.
That's okay. If you're in some way affiliated with the sector and you can write inside, I'm here to listen.
So I've enjoyed the discussion so far, and I know that this is about who's responsible ultimately, but what we're really trying to do, I'm sure, is to have a housing sector where there aren't problems with damp and mould. And as a technology provider, in some ways, it's almost my responsibility to say, well, we know something. We've got a solution, and it's not that simple. And I think Claire's absolutely nailed it. It's about collaborative education, working with the tenants to provide a solution which is beneficial to both parties, and absolutely not blaming the tenant for, well, but you're having a bath, but you're cooking. But so the education piece. So just to jump back, so we're a technology company, and we provide a damp and mould solution, which is a monitor, a quick sales pitch monitor, which works in cellular connectivity and sticks on the wall. So there's no Wi-Fi, there's no power needed. So the installation is really simple and easy. And that begins to monitor a temperature and humidity. We have a days to mould algorithm. So we can see that a property is 900 days to mould or 9 days to mould. And that's really due to the balance of temperature and humidity. So that's giving us the data, but it's not that simple. And I would be fascinated to work with some of you to look at how that might be part of the solution, because we've also implemented some trials recently with dehumidifiers. So again, where we've recognised high levels of humidity, putting in a dehumidifier even for a day can bring humidity from 85% to 55%, which is a much more tolerable level. It's this education piece where we could, I think, work together to say, well, we're monitoring temperature and humidity here. The humidity has got high in this residence. You can't really ask folk to open their windows and freeze to death when it's -8 outside. They can't afford to heat. So what is the solution? And I'm confident that we could come up with something. We're not going to solve all the problems for all the people, but there are definitely bits that we can tweak and improve to get a better solution. But again, the whole education piece, I mean, part of my background is in e-learning. we built an e-learning platform. So that whole idea of education, collaboration and reporting back and, hey, it's improved, this is where we were, this is where we are now. And the language barriers are something worth taking into account. So I'll not say anymore, I'll not take up any.
No, thank you, David. I think it's like anything. If people have got something there, and I liked, particularly you mentioned that is a part of a potential solution, but you know that doesn't cover everything, because you know there's other stuff there, but it's a start. And I think this is where it's sometimes a challenge if people don't know where to start. And at least if you've got, I guess Claire's answer to that, and this Claire Patterson's answer would be, well, it's great if we're going to collect that data, but then are you going to do anything with it? Or are you just going to go, yeah, all of our homes are having a nightmare with damp and mould. Right, well, what are we going to do?
I think that certainly the starting point there is that at the moment we don't have a baseline, because everything's really maybe done on feel, or if there is black mould growing in the wall, then it's a fact.
Or it's based on complaints.
But, well, and what we want to do is not get to complaint. We want to be educating the occupant before we get anywhere near a complaint, to say, hey, guess what? We've discovered this at your property. And if we do these things and we try these things, it'd be great if we could really bring this humidity down and reduce the chance of mould, and work together to do that. And that's what I think it's a collaborative solution.
It absolutely is. Thank you very much, David. I'm going to do a couple of points in the chat, and then I'm going to go to Edward and then to Garfield. So Jordan Clark has said that I think as a sector, unfortunately, takes a tragedy such as this in Rochdale and further back with Grenfell before it causes a reaction. We need to start being far more proactive than being reactive to situations. Education, training, frontline staff is imperative, as well as tenants needs to be mandatory. And Judith said, speaking of Grenfell, are we going to stay away? Are we also going to get away from the stay in your flat when the fire policies and advice, which appears to contribute to the tragedy? For Blockley, we have a damp and mould sensor solution. You've just been through it via to OcuAir, so please do reach out to David. Alison, I find my front line experience at least as valuable as the strategic side when it comes to board conversations and challenges. And it's why, on the side note, I get really frustrated when so many directors and executive teams are made up of people who've never worked at housing on the front line, because actually you try and deal with things that you just can't understand. You can listen, but you haven't been out and seen it. Paula Locke, I had a new build in the past with horrendous damp, believed it at first to be condensation. It was a development fault. Building in heavy rain, builders rubbish put in cavity sealed, let up, and it didn't take long for that to show itself in the new homes. Consideration to the quality and speed of new development must be considered too. I will come on to some more points shortly, but Edward, I'm going to bring you in. Good to have you with us. Nice to bring you to the roundtable.
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, just a very quick one. It was just interesting, sort of the way the conversation flows around taking the issue of condensation, damp and mould, and actually looking sort of wider at the issues and the causes. And I think I was at a conference, and what came up was the fact that poorly heated properties are often at a greater risk of fire, because people who can't afford to put their gas central heating on will use unsafe heating means like fan heaters that are far more dangerous. So low temperature, as well as being a measure of potential fuel poverty and a trigger for condensation, damp and mould, could also be an elevated risk of fire, which you don't think, do you, cold equals fire? But that was interesting. But I think what widens the conversation, because there is the sticking plaster, painting over, bleaching down, etc. But I think the conversation that organisations need to be having is a much wider strategy on their asset their asset strategy, because you might be investing huge amounts of money in retrofitting, in trying to increase EPC ratings, in trying to bring properties up to decent home standards. You might be throwing good money after bad, and actually the difficult conversation might be around demolish, rebuild. And I think that's the 30-year view, and housing associations are normally very good at taking a long view, but in relation to this issue, it does appear that the bleach and the emulsion has taken precedence, rather than a tough decision with some finance bods and a 30-year projection curve. And I think that's where the sector needs to be placing itself to really tackle this and prevent another fatality in the sector, which would clearly be, any life lost is too much, but would clearly be devastating.
I wouldn't be surprised, unfortunately, if we do hear more devastating news this year. I'm just putting it out there. I think we're unfortunately at the tip of the iceberg. I really like your point there, Edward. I was going to just kind of respond and then chat about that one. But I guess if you're doing that, then where does that accountability for you then lie with the board in terms of making the decision on demolish, rebuild the can? Or does it lie with the assets team and the director of that team maybe not being, or development kind of going, well, actually, this is what we need to do? And I think this is where it gets a little bit grey, is yes, the chief exec or the board need to make the final decision, but who's accountable for going, actually, this has been done on my watch? And I think that's where maybe people fell out with the whole Rochdale side of things, was kind of going, well, yes, the chief exec, has left, but what's happened to the assets team? What's happened to the development team? What's happened to the housing team that were out there and saw it? Who actually knew this was going on and almost ignored it, and it was their role to fix it? And I think that's a difficult point. Please respond.
I mean, my personal view is that there's something about professional curiosity. And, anyone who's watched The Crown will have seen, the Queen turn the box of stuff over and start at the bottom. There's something about boards needing to be, what are we not looking at? What are the issues that haven't been raised? And I think, not to give a politician's answer, but there is something about shared responsibility. I think it is for boards to be curious and to be poking around these issues. But similarly, development leads, asset leads, chief execs, heads of service, there needs to be that sort of shared responsibility in terms of looking at asset optimization and looking at the wider asset strategy. And maybe that's the missing piece in the puzzle, that there's been a huge amount of, the lens goes very close to the issue, but actually take a step and a half back. What's the wider implication? And I think you're seeing that around things like decarbonisation and net zero, because if you've got, properties that will never meet EPCC, well, is anyone saying, well, let's get rid of them then, let's demolish them, let's start again? And I think that's difficult, because in the sector, we want to build, we want to increase supply, we don't want to be taking 100 properties out of circulation. But I think to tackle some of these gnarly issues in a murky climate like we have in the UK, I think there is some tough decisions to be taken on some of that old stock, but you've got to do it with data and with people being bought in and on board with the concept, rather than just trying to sort of paper over the issues.
And I think that's where you need the right board in the first place as well. Garfield, I'm going to bring you in. Thank you for being patient. Lovely to have you with us. Oh, I've still got you on mute. There we are.
Sorry,
lovely.
yeah, thank you for having me. I just wanted to talk just a little bit around, or just mention just around the actual communication 360. And I think it's really important that there is a buy-in on all parties. Things like damp and mold issues sometimes takes a lot of time to actually resolve, and it's a lot of involvements with customers still. So I really strongly believe it's around communication and also education, and having the time as well to actually spend and analyze what's going on. And also as well, I believe that there's an aspect of it where the sector looks at a financial side of it still, so it kind of changes customers' perspective on things and buy in to try and resolve the situation. So just for our example, like what's just happened now with the little boy, which is a tragedy. You've got firms out there who's looking to make money off of that sad situation and giving customers wrong advice, and it makes it difficult to actually work on a 360 approach. So I just wanted to just put that out there as well.
Completely agree. Claire, I'm going to bring you in because I know you're going to respond both to Edward and Garfield, and then I'll bring Yasmin back in. But Claire Fouracre, I can see you nodding away there.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. I think he's, Garfield quite right there in terms of the, getting the right messages to tenants is really important. Absolutely agree with that. And it was just a quick response, I guess, on Edward's point. Quite liked his reference there to the Crown and turning the red box over, and just wanted to kind of say, being on a board, it's really important. And I think I've kind of mentioned it a few times about that connection with tenants, and it's something that personally I hold quite high up on my priorities. So for me, I'm not just turning the red box, but sometimes leave the box on the table, and we do a lot of walkabouts. We're quite a small organisation, so actually getting and speaking to the tenants personally, and it does help. I've got that frontline experience. I'm sort of familiar and able to do that. I'm more comfortable, but I think that is absolutely right. Kind of not just taking what's presented, but digging under the issues is really, really important. So I just sort of wanted to acknowledge that and show agreement on that with Edward there.
Absolutely brilliant. And I know, I completely agree with Garfield's points. And I think there's some clear, I think, unity across the sector right now to try and fix this. Accountability is key, but as our solution. So I like the fact we're kind of discussing a blend right now. Yasmin, I'm going to bring you in, and then I'm going to jump to, looks like 18 new messages in the chat, so I need to get onto that shortly. But Yasmin, let me bring you in.
Hi, thank you for having me. Good morning to everybody. I just wanted to say, and it's kind of an offset of what I've put in the chat as well. I still think, and I know I rant about this quite a lot, I still think that people need to be taught how to live in their homes a lot better. They need to be taught what the effects are of like drying your laundry inside and kind of not ventilating your property for like 10-15 minutes a day, which is not a lot. I don't think that's a great deal of time to be having doors and windows open. I work in complaints, and I have really seen an increase these past 2 months in everybody's just suspicious about they've got damp and mold in their homes. I work for Southern Housing, and I'm actually really happy with the way that they've kind of they've taken it up a notch now. What they've done is anyone that reports damp and mold, that property gets surveyed. Like, it's a totally no nonsense approach. We're not going through any questionnaires or triages. We will send out a surveyor appointment to go out there and have a look. But then I think to myself at the back of the mind, why were we not doing this already? Why did it take the death of that young child, poor Awa Bashak, for us to kind of, step up and kind of, it was really tragic what happened, and I think it was upsetting for the whole sector. But I don't think damp and mold is solely the responsibility of the landlord, and I don't agree, and I've already put that in the chat as well. I don't agree. I do not agree, and I know it might sound a bit rebellious, but I don't agree that it's the responsibility of the landlord all the time. I think
sometimes there are things which people don't do to help, but for example, like today it's -4. I'm fortunate enough that I can put my heating on every now and then. If you can't afford to put your heating on, but you need to dry your clothes, then how you're not going to be able to open. I guess the response would be you can't open a door or window because it's, well, you'll be freezing all day. So what do you do in that situation? I think I'm not by any means saying I'm taking it away from the tenant completely, but is the damp and mold always purely because the tenant isn't looking after the property, or is it the poor quality of the stock? I don't know what you're finding on that side, Yasmin.
I think it's a mix. I think it's a mixture of the two elements, really. But I just also think that tenants need to be educated on how to live smarter and live better in their homes, and I think they just need to be informed of what the effects are of damp and mold as well.
So do you think that comes down to maybe the delivery of the training? Do you think it's being a bit too scripted and a bit too kind of, this is what you must do, and people aren't engaging with it?
I think it's lack of engagement as well. I think over the last 10-12 years of being in social housing, I have seen a real lack of engagement with residents. I haven't seen it increase. That's
fair. Thank you very much. I know a few businesses who have turned around to me and said our big fear right now is we're going to be the next news on Inside Housing. And it probably ties in a bit to what you said there, because tenant power is increasing massively, and there are tenants saying, "Oh, actually, look, come and sort this, or else I'm going to write to the paper because it will get printed." And so that's the thing. I'm going to bring you in 2 seconds. I'm going to just go a couple of points from the chat. Iona, should there be more funding available for retrofit initiatives for non-standard construction properties, which where my team and we make 60% of our stock. We're reliant on EEIS funding for our retrofit initiatives, but this only touches the tip of the iceberg. Stacey has asked, has anyone started to develop training and toolkits for frontline staff to reframe the language, working with recognising vulnerabilities and signs? I think that ties in a bit with what Yasmin mentioned there, and I completely agree. There's that relationship, and I know we talked about the white paper, but the white paper was the end of 2020. It's over 2 years now, and yet people are still only really starting to change their relationship work with their tenants now. It's trying to, catch the horse after it's bolted kind of thing a little bit. Sarah Jackson also heard of examples of providers reducing the size of housing officer patches and moving back to generic models of service delivery to support frontline staff, being able to have a greater understanding of the stock they manage and to build relationships with customers and enable those important conversations. Just me, I wish that was the case everywhere. Some of the patch sizes are just too big. They just are, and no one's going to manage patches of that size. And Anna Henderson, can anyone share what their boards are asking for in terms of regular updates? Is it number of work orders raised, number of properties affected, or is it the human stories, or all of the above? On my side, it's all of the above. We're particularly also monitoring complaints and how things are coming in on those sides. But like I say, I'm at the beginning of that board journey and probably couldn't talk long term, but I'm sure others can. David, I'm going to bring you in, and then I'm going to go to Mal. I've still got you on mute.
Me?
Yes, please.
I'll be quick. I'm conscious of the nature of housing. If you've got flats all south facing and all the same and not having any external reason for damp and mould, and you have a complaint from one, it is quite easy to actually say, well, we have monitors in the 10 flats or the 20 flats, which are all similar, and there's only one or two with damp and mould issues. It probably is lifestyle based, and the education piece there is a bit more obvious. So
yeah, that's a really fair point. Yeah, it's I guess then you have a better idea whether it's a stock issue, whether it's a tenant issue, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so my point there is really just from that point of view, that's where having a baseline of data is interesting, because if you have a flat and there's been someone in it for 5 years and there's a new tenant moves in within 6 months of damp and mold complaint, we know what history looks like. Then we've got a full audit trail of what the flat looked like, and we can look at tenant behaviour and do some education. So.
No, really good point. Thank you. I know Yasmin there was said I know she said it before, like they're surveying everyone that has a damp and mold issue, and it's brilliant to hear, because let's get out and actually work with people to resolve this. Mal, I'm going to bring you in. Good to have you with us today.
Hi, Matt. Sorry I joined late, but just picking up your conversations. I've done a very detailed review for one provider and a skim review for another provider, but the learning outcomes from those reviews are stark. They're commonalities between the two providers, which are very different providers in different parts of the country, are exactly the same. Pick up on the point about language. Language is the key. So when I reviewed the guidance, the websites, and what information they were providing to their customers, it was absolutely the same. We do something to do with your property. If it's anything not to do with the property, it's down to you, tenant or customer, you get on with it. So language is key, and they are starting to review the language they publish and the language they use with their customers about damp and mould. But the key here is, I think within your discussion, one of the things I discussed at Homes UK about disrepair, and it's common here, is about there's three things to do with damp and mould and disrepair. One is the property. We all know that what we need to do with our properties to make them habitable. Two is the processes we adopt. But the third one, the key one that we miss out, is the people part of this whole issue. Do we really know our customers? And I call on the customers. I do not refer to tenants or leaseholders or shared owners, whatever. They are our customers at the end of the day, and we aren't engaging with them. We've lost that thread with our customers. Do we really know the people that are living in our homes and their needs? So we profess to provide housing to meet their needs, but we don't know our customers, we don't know our needs. In order to address these issues, and there are 29 hazards in HSRSS we should be addressing, we need to know our people. We need to come back to that social purpose that we were as providers.
My turn to not be on mute. No, look, really interesting call, and I think that whole point about knowing your customers was what I was hoping the white paper was going to have a significant impact on, but it seems to be taking a bit longer than perhaps I hoped it would. But I certainly can't disagree with a number of your points that you've made there, and I mean, it does touch a little bit, I guess, on what we said before about patch sizes and actually being able to know what's going on in your stock. But I also loved your point about language being key, and I know it's been made a couple of times today, but knowing how to communicate with people, there needs to be a huge shift, I feel, amongst customer service in housing and in other sectors across the UK at the moment. There's been such demand on from the last few years across through the pandemic and things, and actually that we need a bit of a reset. Go on, Mal, yes, please.
Yeah, just to pick up another point, which was about who's responsible for this, going back to governance. Your boards are absolutely responsible for this. This is why they exist, to hold you and the officers and what you're delivering to account. There's a really interesting paper, if you get a chance to read it, and I don't often say this, published by the Houses of Commons on the future of the regulator. So they've released their first findings. It's the Regulation of Housing first report for session 2022-23. And it's from the Housing and Communities Committee. and it talks about how they're going to change regulation, or they suggest and recommend how to change regulation. But it's a really balanced report. And as I said, I don't often say that about House of Commons reports, but it is a really balanced report. But governance sits with your boards. They should be setting the tone, strategic direction, and the values of your organisation and holding you to account.
Gemma Smith agrees with you in the comments. She said risk management frameworks need to pick up risks of stakeholder safety, and boards need assurance they are being managed. Gas and fire safety, etc. Yesterday, damp and mould today. What's next? And my only, I guess, response to that to make sure you've got an executive team that are being honest with the board. But then I suppose if the board's good enough, is it deep diving enough? Lara, I'm going to bring you in, or do I go Lara, President of the CIA? Lovely to see you again.
Lovely to see you all again. Thank you. I mean, I agree with lots of stuff that's been said already. So I just wanted to add a different perspective on the role of the boardroom. I won't say the problem with boards is as boards, you get lots of reports. It's got lots of KPIs. It's like 98% performance is brilliant by any standards. 98% is great. So as a board member, you see 98%, you think, oh, brilliant, that's fine. My challenge to the boards that I sit on and everyone else in here that's in the boardroom is, well, what's happening with that 2%? And it's that 2% that we tend to forget because we think, oh, it's all green. We've got green. It's 98. It's brilliant. That 2% could be 20 families who are suffering from damp and mould where things have gone wrong. And I think that's one of the, I'm not blaming anybody here. It's just the nature of human beings. It's that 2%, that 1%. Who are those individual families? If 1% of your stock equals 10 homes, that's 10 homes that are not happy. And I also say that with the staff surveys and customer feedback, we've got 98% staff who say it's fabulous. Well, I want to know what the 2%, what is the problem that those 2% have? And I think as board members, we tend to see the green and move on. So that's my challenge to boards. And then the other thing I wanted to say really quickly with regards to damp and mould is that I think in addition to everything that everybody else has said, I'm not contradicting anyone else. I do think that it's also an issue that is bigger than the social housing sector. We have shared owners, private homeowners and tenants with private landlords who have exactly the same issues with damp and mould. It's a bigger structural issue than just the relationship we have with our tenants. We're the good guys. We actually care about this. If you own your own home, I know elderly people who own their own homes and have damp and mold, and they can't blame. There's no one that they can go to complain to. They own the property, but they don't have the resources, the needs, the knowledge to solve that problem. So it is partly to do with a lot what's going on in the country, the cost of living, the cost of heating your homes, and the stock that we have that is not adequate for the lifestyles that we live these days. And I'll end there because I was going to say something about professionalism, but I'm saying if we have to professionalize, we have to tell someone that living in damp and mold is not a good thing, then I think they're in the wrong sector anyway. That shouldn't be something that we have to go on a training course to show someone. Anyway, I'll stop there. Those are my two key points I wanted to add to the discussion.
No, thank you. And I do wonder whether or not actually this one thing this tragedy has done is made people realise just how dangerous damp and mold can be. I think that might have highlighted, because fire safety, okay, we know what goes on with fire, burning is bad, but damp and mold, I don't know if everyone knew quite the dangers that it could deliver. I'm going to bring Judith Radcliffe in just a moment. A couple of points in the chat. Sam Horton, we found attic ventilation fans very effective in increasing ventilation without noticeably reducing indoor temperatures. They are quite effective in reducing damp and mold issues. It would be interesting to see how you went about kind of sourcing and developing those, because evidently cost is always an issue, but it shouldn't be when it comes to life expectation, which is almost what we're talking about on a number of things here. Taras, again, apologies if I'm saying your name wrong. They had a situation when a tenant in a self-contained flat was doing things on purpose so she could get a bigger flat. We moved 3 times to 3 different flats. Previous tenants staying there over the year never had issues with mold. Not wanting to blame tenants and don't want to get them homeless, but recently noticed this pattern. So they're taking action that they know is going to get them moved. Again, that comes to a relationship piece. And knowing your tenants and the fact that you know that that's what's going on, there's definitely more you can do there. and Claire backing you up, a few cases of D&T being weaponised to achieve a move. I'm going to come back to the chat in a moment, but Judith, I'm jumping to you. Have I lost Judith?
There we go. Can you hear me now?
I can. Can't see you, but
Yay!
can you, that's fine.
Happily sitting there going, so let's just have a chat on mute. Always good, that.
Nice to have you with us.
Apologies, let me get on with it so that I'm not taking up too much time. Just to come back really briefly to David's point, and it was a really good point and a point very well made. However, I would like to put the opposing view to that, if I can, without wishing to be even remotely, inflammatory or anything like that.
We'll just have a conversation.
Purely because, albeit I accept that on the one hand, it may look like if you've had somebody for 7 years that has had no issues whatsoever, and then somebody comes in and they're raising all these issues and all that kind of stuff, it might look like that. It kind of goes back to the point I was raising at the beginning, where you can't just make assumptions. The tenants are not the bad guys here, generally speaking. And I don't want to say that anybody's the bad guy here. We're all good guys. Everybody's good guys, like on whichever side of the fence you sit. So I suppose that's point number one. The tenant is not the bad guy, no matter whether they've come in first, last, or in the middle. Second of all, I guess the key point here is you can't just go, oh, the data says this, therefore this is the scenario. We've analysed it like this, therefore it shows that. Statistics are enormously misleading. And I can explain that very easily by saying, go look at an episode of Yes Minister and look at the perfect balanced sample sketch from there, which shows that if you flip a survey one way, you can make it show one thing. And if you flip a survey another way, you can make it show something that is the complete opposite. That's just one way in which data can be extremely misleading. But from this particular point, I can use an anecdote to show. So I won't say who, but somebody that I know particularly well. And this was with a private landlord, so not social housing related at all, but this was a private landlord. And they had noxious vapours coming through the floor of their flat from a nail bar beneath it. They had mice in the flat. They reported all these things, and they essentially, unfortunately, became a serial complainant to this particular landlord. And the problem was, of course, one of the landlord's responses was, oh, well, nobody had any issues with this previously. That doesn't mean they weren't there. It means that either the tenant didn't, it's a bit like whistleblowing. People don't complain because they don't want to kick up a fuss, because they don't want to get kicked out of the flat. And sometimes a landlord can give them a very bad reaction back, either ending the tenancy or whatever else it can be. So people can fear that. And that's a genuine fear, I think. From my understanding, this is obviously my understanding of these things. I'm not saying it's generic, and obviously all views are relevant and valid here. It can be because they just don't like to complain. I know a huge number of people who, no matter how bad a situation gets, whether with health or landlords or whatever it happens to be, don't feel like they can complain or feel like they mustn't complain or don't want to inconvenience anybody. So that also can be a reason why for 7 years, somebody may have lived with the mould. They may not have known it was mould. I acknowledge the wider education piece that people have also been raising here about, do the tenants really know? How much can they be expected to know, and so on and so forth. So I suppose to make it really short, there is a lot at play here, and please don't just look at the data and make assumptions. It's extremely dangerous to do that in any scenario, but particularly in one as sensitive as this.
Thank you, and a very, very eloquent point made. I know that people have mentioned in the chat there, Claire Patterson has said that, again, that lack of lived experience in social housing and a lack of frontline experience plays a part. And I think that's where almost your point about the data would be helped if people who are going, that might be the case. And as Lara pointed out, but what about the 2%? This doesn't mean it's all okay. What are we actually looking at? Lauren just said they're using switching units as part of their approach long term. And Anthony Davis, a strong audit trail and exhausting our options while documenting it is needed. Taking a similar or same approach to gas safety inspections would also be a good approach. Shelley, I know some people are starting to have to bounce, but I'm going to bring you in because this is still flowing. So I expect we've probably got about another 5-10 minutes left. If people can stay, great. If you can't, I completely understand. But Shelley, let me bring you in.
Hi, Matt. Thanks ever so much. I'm really sorry I haven't had my camera on today, but I've been hot-footing between this session and a session that the Institute of Housing have been running. And I just really wanted to say...
They do like having stolen my spot. This was my spot first.
I realise that. There was a completely different tone about that session. This is much more engaging, much more positive. The Institute of Housing session very much about environmental health officers and the backlog and inspections. So I just wanted to commend you, Matt, because I've really enjoyed it, and thank you.
Oh, thanks. Like I said, this was never put together from anything but a genuine. I love networking. I love speaking to people, and someone recently said they wanted me to change my LinkedIn thing, which I did, to the social housing recruiter who actually knows about social housing. Because one of the big frustrations, I think, in the sector as a whole is that people speak with businesses, not just recruiters, but tech companies. They go to the CIH conference, whatever else, and they're just going, well, you don't really understand what social housing is. You don't listen. And as I say, we ran 48 of these last year, and it was my absolute privilege to do so, because I get to learn and listen and network, but also change does happen and change does get made. And there's no point in, I said this a little while ago, and I know you were probably on the roundtables when I said it, I never want a roundtable to be a place where people just come on and moan, because that doesn't achieve anything. Sitting here and all come together and whinging about what the problems are achieves absolutely nothing. The idea behind this is to come together and go, okay, well, what can we do? What actions, even if it's tiny, first steps, what can we do? What should boards be asking? How do we make people more accountable? Do we need customer service training? What is it we need to look at? Because we have to do something. And sitting here going, it's a nightmare. Okay, great. It's why last year I didn't run one for ages on the cost of living crisis, because nobody had any answers to it. So I was going, someone was saying to me, when are we doing a cost of living crisis? I was like, someone come to me with some good ideas and we'll run it. In terms of the chat, Yasmin said she doesn't agree with the Ombudsman conclusion that damp and mould is not down to lifestyle. I know you brought that one up, and I'm really glad that you did. And not understanding the need or importance of ventilation. I own a massive increase in disrepair claims, with solicitors advising tenants not to let the housing provider in and telling them they'll get £10,000 compensation. We've seen a lot of vulnerable tenants approached by these firms, often parting with cash on the doorstep. I think that probably comes up with the point made earlier as well, that somebody made, that was about poor advice being given and people just believing that they can, you know, make money and all kind of other things off this, which is terrifying. Look, with the financial struggles facing organisations to deliver more for less, where will the money come from? What else will be cut? I think that's what contributes to these terrible incidents. Stealing from Peter to pay Paul. We change our focus, but with no extra money. What I wouldn't love to see in terms of more investment in social housing providers who are actually trying to deliver it for the right reasons. I think, unfortunately, there is money in the social housing sector. I can promise you. And if you don't, not sure there is, then please go and have a look at the Inside Housing report on the salaries being paid to some chief execs, because there is money in the sector. There is money coming through. There is a big disparity sometimes between the pay in social housing. There's often some odd business decisions made as well, sometimes according to salary, but that's a whole other conversation, and I don't want to upset people. With Radcliffe, is there a fear factor to get over where perhaps some tenants want to report but worry they might not be believed? I know you brought that one up in the chat, and I think it's a completely fair point. Anna Henderson, having resident liaison officers with specific knowledge and skill set to handle these conversations rather than the old school contract review may lead to a faster change in narrative. Again, I think that comes down to lived experience and knowing what actually is going on. Patterson, boards and everyone else need to be so careful when reviewing stats. Not only could the 2% have huge problems, the data might not even be measuring the right things. Stacey has asked, is anyone happy to share the training toolkits resources they're using to reframe the language to support frontline staff in changing the language? If anyone is, please reach out to Stacey. I always tag everybody in this on LinkedIn afterwards. Please connect with each other and engage. And Anthony said we shouldn't be waiting for tenants to complain. The property is owned by us and in our best interest to ensure it holds its value and is of a livable standard. I can see why it isn't possible. I can't see why it isn't possible to visit at least once a year. Key question, this is from Mal. All your boards need to ask is, are the homes fit for purpose? And by fit for purpose, I don't mean decent home. Would you be happy to live in it? And I know Lara's brought this up before, is would I put my mum in that property? Would I be happy with my family living in that property? If it's a no, then it needs to change. Lots in the chat, lots in the conversation, a really interesting, brilliant conversation today. Claire Fouracre, can I bring you in for last thoughts on how you found today and yeah, I guess your key takeaways?
Yeah, well, thanks thanks again for having me, I guess, and for everyone's contributions. It's been fascinating discussion, really. Obviously, following on from my few slides, some really good takeaways there. I think in terms of the points raised around the language, the advice that tenants are getting, and some of that as well, and how that's perhaps affecting them. They're quite worrying, really, some of the stuff there about the solicitors and the disrepair. Again, that was something that was reported, that shouldn't stop us from dealing with damp and mould if there's legal action commencing, but if it's inhibiting tenants because of the getting bad advice, that's really concerning. And I think just for me, some personal takeaways, really like Lara's point about the other 2%. I think that's just a personal takeaway there for me. So yeah, thank you everybody. Thanks very much.
You're very welcome. Lara has just put in the chat there, please, if you aren't members of CIH, join. They need the voices. They need people like you joining and actually wanting to make change. I'm just putting a quick point in the chat now. If you want to join the mailing list for the Social Housing Roundtable, I've just put it in the chat. You'll get access to the recordings and future events. Next week, I'm bringing back another guest from last year. If you don't know Emily Orme, she's absolutely superb. And I asked her, Emily Orme was the lady who last year decided to bring the conversation, should we put does social housing need a mandatory qualification? And that is a debate and a half if you want to go back and watch that on YouTube channel. But next week actually ties in really nicely today with what we're talking about, because next week we're going to be, it's a pros cons kind of thing. It's tenant engagement versus tenant influence and what that looks like in social housing at the moment. So please sign up and register if you'd like to. I'll put that out tomorrow. But for now, thank you everyone. Great to see some new faces, great to see some old faces, and I look forward to seeing you all at a future event in the future. Take care. Cheers.
Thank you. See you later.
Thanks very much.
Bye now.